Francis, and this is chapter 1 of my book Mission on the Outside. It's called Keeping a Low Profile. From John's Gospel chapter 4 verses 1 to 3 we read, "Now when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee." Our story finds Jesus in the good and holy territory of Judea, occupied by God's chosen people, the Jews. Things at this point really seem to have been going well for Jesus. Initially in the Gospel, we've been introduced to cousin John, who has established quite a reputation for himself as a fiery preacher and prophet. The crowds had sought out John, and despite his complete inability to win friends and influence people, with nice words and carefully honed preaching skills, still the people came. They responded and were baptized as a sign that they took seriously his call to live lives in a way that evidenced their belief in a holy God. And yet, since Jesus had got himself baptized, returned from a short stint in the wilderness, and begun his own preaching tour, John's crowds had dwindled and Jesus' crowds had increased. Most people in our present-day churches would have thought that this was a good thing, and that this would definitely have been exactly what Jesus was looking for. As Randy Stonehill claims in his song Great Big Stupid World, if Jesus came back today, we'd put him on the Oprah Winfrey Show. We'd want to give him a public profile, get him on television, organise mass rallies and market his message, in bite-sized chunks of course. However, if you have ever had the opportunity to do a course in church growth, I've done a number, you'll be surprised to learn that Jesus doesn't seem to have discovered the same principles or techniques that many of the church growth experts push. In fact, one begins to wonder whether he was as interested in gathering together crowds of people as we modern Christians often seem to be. Of course, it is evident that despite Jesus' growing ability to pull in the people, there also began to grow the correlating unhealthy interest of the Pharisees. They were not as pleased as we might be over Jesus' popularity, and presumably were starting to get ready for a bit of a showdown. If this was the case, and if Jesus was aware of such a showdown, then it makes a certain amount of sense that he decides it is time to pull up the pegs and relocate to Galilee, where hopefully the positive interest will outweigh the negative. However we might choose to interpret the scenario, we only have to get to the story of the feeding of the 5,000 found in John chapter 6, where Jesus had yet again managed to draw a whopping crowd as a result of the healings that he had performed. According to the version of this story in Mark 6, he had also managed to get in some good and well-applied biblical teaching. He then follows it up with a signs and wonders display that has the crowds literally eating out of his disciples' hands. All good stuff as far as the proponents of church growth would tell us, particularly those in the signs and wonders camp. Surely now would be a good time for a short gospel message followed up by some mood music and an altar call. Oops, I did forget the obligatory offering to contribute to the ongoing work of the ministry. The disciples evidently had enough baskets for the fish and bread, and these would have well sufficed to receive the collection. But against all the best wisdom in the world, Jesus withdraws. He ups and leaves. I mean, the people were even acknowledging him as the prophet who is to come into the world. Surely they are only one step away from acknowledging him as Messiah and Saviour of the world. They are on their way to being fully signed up believers, and they are all good Jews, the very people God had sent him to. If this was not enough, after doing his walking on water thing and ending up with his disciples on the other side of the lake, the crowds track him down. If nothing else, surely this has got to be evidence of some sort of commitment. But again, and I really struggled with John chapter 6 when I first preached on it years ago, because it so clearly cut against the grain of the books and the seminars I'd encountered. Jesus begins questioning the integrity of the people. He follows this up by preaching some obscure sermon about drinking his blood and eating his body. Even his own disciples think it's weird and tell him so. The crowd have had enough, and any chance of founding a church or even a discipleship school disappear out the window in one fell swoop. Jesus is now left with his original 12 disciples, and presumably with any reputation he had gained via his miracles, now in tatters. And yet, through all the Gospels, whether in the Synoptics or as we have read in John, we see Jesus' wariness concerning crowds. We also see no evidence of a desire on his part to attempt to garner a reputation. Instead, even though he is indeed the light of the world, the bread of life, the way, the truth, and the life, and we could go on, he refuses to glorify himself, but instead always wants to glorify the Father. Now, it may seem that I'm potentially making a mountain out of a molehill, especially given the obscure reference to John chapter 4 to Jesus leaving Judea to head for Galilee, and the fact that John doesn't give any explanation why Jesus decides to make the journey when he did. What we find, of course, is Jesus doing the Father's work, having a rest beside a well in Samaritan territory, talking to an evidently dysfunctional and promiscuous Samaritan woman, with nary a crowd inside.